Well, everyone, you already know we have to talk about the successor to the original iPad Air that I talked about yesterday, which is actually the iPad Air 2. And this iPad came out back in 2014, and it's definitely an interesting device overall. It's definitely lasted longer than I thought it was going to be in terms of software, so that's always a really good thing when Apple, supports their devices for an extra longer period of time. And I do have a cold, so please apologize if I sound a little weird right now, but it's all good, Now, the iPad Air 2 actually came out in 2014, which is kind of funny because really nothing has changed with the iPad Air lineup until like last year, where the iPad Air 3 came out. So we really haven't seen a successor to the iPad Air until 2019, which was super crazy, or at least the iPad Air 2. And that one is pretty much just the iPad Pro 10.5 inch reincarnated into an iPad Air 3. But regardless, this is still a super cool device, and the fact that it's still getting software updates is literally beyond me. I love it when Apple and just phone manufacturers in general support their devices for longer. Wink wink Samsung, who doesn't do that at all, and hopefully they will at some point. Looking on the front of the iPad Air 2, you can see that we have a 9.7 inch IPS panel, and that one is actually 1536 by 2040. Now in terms of the overall panel, really we haven't seen any iPads go with an OLED display yet, so it's perfectly fine as an IPS panel. I don't really want to hate on it too much there. But really, one thing that I actually like about this iPad, and the thing that's held up the most, is probably the screen. With the panel itself, there's not a visible air gap between the glass and the LCD. There's just, it just seems like you're just touching the display itself. And I've owned the iPad Air, the first one, as a main tablet, not just to review it, but I owned it to actually use it. And I never really noticed it until I bought the iPad Air 2, that there was quite a bit of difference in the panel. So that's a humongous thing to note. This panel specifically, could potentially be better than even like the base model iPad of the last year or whatever it came out, that $299 iPad. This panel technically is better than that one, which is a huge thing to note. This thing also has a lightning port, which is cool, a headphone jack, super cool thing to note, and on the back a single camera setup, and that really covers it up in terms of the outside. There's really nothing too much going on with it. There's really nothing to hate on it. Obviously with the front, there's quite a bit of bezel on it, and that's one thing that if you compare it to the iPad Pros or something that you might notice, obviously the iPad Pros of 2018 look so much better than this thing, but it's really not that big of a deal. I don't really think people are getting this thing. They're going to complain about, oh my god, this thing doesn't look as good as the new ones. They can easily go and get the new ones if they want to, or even get the iPad Pro 10.5 inch that I've already reviewed. But this thing, regardless, in terms of the design and everything, you have Touch ID and everything, which is really cool too. So that kind of sums up the outside. No IP certification or anything, but I don't think any iPad has IP certification, so I think the design is still pretty much up there. I don't think it's a bad design tablet at all. Now, hitting on these software updates, this is where things get kind of interesting and a little weird, to be honest. This thing was released with iOS 8.1. We were able to get iPad OS 13 on it, which is the latest version of iPad OS. I think it's 13.3 right now. By the time you're watching this, the next version might already be out. Apple's taking their time with iOS 13, which is kind of annoying. But in terms of software updates, I'm pretty sure it's not getting any more software updates. It's pretty much done at iPad OS 13. It really makes no sense for Apple to... I was surprised this thing even got iPad OS 13, because this thing has almost the same chipset as the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus. This one has the Apple A8X chip. The other iPhone 6 has the A8 chip. So I thought at first probably it wasn't going to get it, but it eventually did. So I guess that's a cool thing. But I think this had more things to do with the RAM than with the chipset itself, but in terms of software, it still handles it pretty decently. You have 2 gigabytes of RAM on this device, so the whole entire UI, it seems to be pushing things pretty well. It's not a bad software for this thing to end on either. I've always found that for some reason, whenever a bad software on an iPhone, usually on the iPads, it's pretty decent. With iOS 11, we kind of know that it wasn't really the best on iPhones, but on my iPad, it was pretty decent. I was actually pretty happy to say that. And with iPad OS 13, it's more of the same. At first, it was a little rocky in the beginning but now it's actually perfectly fine. And even on an Air 2 or anything like that, it's going to run perfectly fine as well. So in terms of software, that really pretty much covers it. But there is a humongous thing to note, and that's actually the checkra jailbreak. This iPad is supported with that jailbreak, which is a really cool thing. So it's an unpatchable jailbreak. You can easily go and just keep using it and jailbreak it whenever you want to on any version of iOS or iPad OS, which is super awesome. And that's a humongous development that we've seen in actually the last couple months. So last year we really didn't see it, but this year we do have it, which is an awesome thing. So you have that capability on this iPad, which a lot of other iPads, some of them are compatible, but some of them aren't as well. So you have that capability on this iPad, which is a really cool thing. So that really pretty much covers it up in terms of the software. Nothing really much else to hit on here. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this thing was released with the Apple A8X chip, like I stated, a 3-core CPU. This is really weird. We don't usually see 3 cores. We usually see dual core or quad core, but this thing had a triple core CPU. And there were a couple different models of the iPad Air 2. There was a 16, 32, 64, and 128 gigabyte model, and all of those models had 2 gigabytes of RAM. So there wasn't like one specific model that had more RAM. They had the same amount of RAM, which is really cool. So you can get the base model, which I wouldn't recommend you to do if you're getting an iPad. At least go for the 64 gigabyte model, but all those models had 2 gigabytes of RAM. What I can tell you in terms of the performance is it's not a bad performing iPad. I mean, really, it's more of the same. There's going to be some glitchiness here and there. And like I stated, iPad OS 13, it's definitely smooth, and it's definitely, has some cool features here and there, but it does kind of take up some resources in the background here and there sometimes on some iPads. And even though it's pretty stock for the most part, there's still some weird little bugs here and there. Like one, for example, is the location services, but that's kind of a minor one and it doesn't really affect a bunch of people. But this iPad for sure, in terms of performance, is actually really, really good. Whenever you're doing something minimal, like if you're a student and you're just needing to write notes all the time or something, I think you're going to have a perfectly fine experience with it. I don't think you're going to be hating on it because, oh my god, this thing can't do this and this. This thing does not support the Apple Pencil, which is a pretty big deal for some students. So if you're in need of that, then you can go for the next model of iPad, which the iPad Pro 10.5 inch does support the Apple Pencil, which is really cool. But in terms of, if you're writing papers and if you're going to go to the next app and, keeping apps in the background and everything, it's not bad. And I think you might have a pretty decent experience with it, which is good. Of course, the newer iPads are much faster and everything, but this one for a student case wouldn't be that bad. If you need it for like work or something, like I don't really know what you're going to use an iPad for work when you use a MacBook or something, but it'll get the job done for the most part. It is a little glitchy here and there though. That's the only major issue, is that sometimes it does get a little glitchy whenever you're doing some things with it, but going through the UI and keeping apps in the background is not as bad as you might think for a device that came out in 2014. So in terms of performance, if you're a student, it's going to be okay. If you're trying to, do intensive games and all that stuff, you might have a little bit of a different experience with it, but it definitely will get the job done at the end of the day, like I've stated. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it. Now hitting on the camera, this thing has a single 8 megapixel camera on the back and a 1.2 megapixel front facing camera. And what I can tell you about this camera is, at least the back one, it's not bad. It's pretty much like the iPhone 6 camera ported over to an iPad, and it's not a bad camera. I mean, I guess it gets the job done. You can do 1080p videos, no 4K videos or anything like that. And, it's an iPad camera. I don't think you're expecting it to be the best thing ever. It gets the job done. So I think, that's more than enough for it to go to. The front camera, like I said, 1.2 megapixels, and it's really just mainly used for FaceTime. I mean, like I said, this is an iPhone 6 camera for the most part, ported over onto an iPad, so take that as you will. But I definitely do think, at least it has a camera, at least it has a front camera or even a back camera. So I think in terms of the camera quality, that pretty much covers it there as well. Now, ending it off with the battery life. This thing has a 7,340 milliamp hour battery within it, and that is actually a very, very good size battery for an iPad. And what's kind of weird though is that the iPad Air, the original one, had a bigger battery than this. I think that one had like 8,400, but regardless, this thing still gets the job done for the most part. And this battery, I mean, think about it this way, okay? This thing came out in 2014. Even if the battery has degraded, let's say like a couple thousand milliamp hours, you're still at like 5,000 milliamp hours or like 6,000 even in some cases. So you're still going to have a pretty decent battery life device overall. And that's one of the best things I like about iPads, is that the battery life and the battery size is just super respectable for the device. And it's not even that thick of a device. I mean, it's like a pretty thin device overall. Of course, it's much bigger, but this device's battery will definitely get the job done. Standby time is great, and overall, the battery segment of this device is probably one of its biggest pros, especially in 2020, going into 2020. And to kind of sum up the video and to answer the question, is the iPad Air 2 still worth it in 2020? I will say, yeah, I think it's still worth it in 2020. I think it has a lot going for it still. It's still getting software updates, which is super respectable. It's still getting all these cool little bells and whistles and features from iPad OS 13. It's built pretty decent. It's pretty cheap to get. It's one of the oldest supported iPads right now. Performance wise, it's still pretty respectable. It has a lot going for it in that department. It has cameras, which is cool, and that battery life and battery size is super respectable for the price and age that you're going to be paying for this phone. So yeah, I think it's still worth it. If you can spend a little bit more money, I would rather you get an iPad Pro 10.5 inch. That might be the better way of going into 2020, especially because that thing will get a couple more years of software support over the iPad Air 2. But regardless, I still have a lot of respect for the iPad Air 2, and it still has a lot going for it in my opinion. So that pretty much covers it. If you want to pick up an iPad Air 2 or the iPad Pro 10.5 inch, I'll find the cheapest one on Amazon and link it down in the description below so you guys can get it from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that is pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section as well. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it would mean so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.